I still remember the sound of that door. It didn't just close. It cracked through the air like a gavel, sealing my fate. My father's hand was steady on the knob, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with disgust. "You are a disgrace to this family," he spat. His voice carried the weight of the church pews, the judgment of the congregation, the cold echo of every whispered hymn about purity and honor. I was 19. My belly barely showed, but the secret was out. Pregnant. Unmarried. Marked. The porch light above me glowed, but it did not welcome me. It burned like a spotlight, exposing my shame. I begged with my eyes, for mercy, for understanding, but he didn't even look back. The door slammed, the bolt slid, and I was on the wrong side of everything I had ever known. I stood there with a duffel bag and a necklace chain that pressed into my palm, the last gift from my mother, before silence swallowed her, too. The bus stop down the road was the only place left to sit, so I walked into the night with the weight of exile pressing on my shoulders. That sound, the slam, the click, etched itself into me. Every door I would pass afterward, every porch light I'd see on lonely streets, carried the echo of that night. 2 decades later, I heard another sound at a door, but this time it wasn't me standing outside. It was him. The gate of my own house creaked open as Albert, my steward, logged a new visitor into the ledger. His voice carried down the hall. "Madam General, your father has arrived." The words were almost absurd. My father, the same man who once exiled me, was now at my threshold. And beyond that door, in just a few breaths, he would be introduced, not as master, not as deacon, not even as father, but as the guest of General Cole. When I walked away from that porch at 19, the night didn't just swallow me, it branded me. I wasn't Madison Cole, daughter of Deacon Thomas Cole, anymore. I was the scandal, the whispered warning, the sermon in a skirt. My father wore his title like armor. Every Sunday he stood at the pulpit's side, the Bible in his hand, his voice rich and commanding as he prayed over the flock. To the congregation he was a shepherd. To me, he was a judge. "Train up a child in the way she should go," he'd thunder. "And when she is old, she will not depart from it." His eyes would land on me like a punishment, even before I was pregnant, as though he could smell rebellion in my skin. My brother David never felt that heat. He was the golden child, captain of the football team, straight-A student, baptized twice just for the applause. At Sunday dinners, he bowed his head just long enough to be noticed. My father adored him. My mother simply nodded, poured tea, and pretended balance existed at that table. When my secret surfaced, it wasn't just my father's wrath that hit me. It was the collective gasp of a small town that loved to weigh sin like coins on a scale. "A deacon's daughter," they whispered, "and with no husband?" Their pity wasn't soft, it was sharp, a blade coated in scripture. The night he threw me out, my mother pressed a necklace into my palm, a simple silver chain. Her eyes brimmed with words she couldn't speak. She turned away before the door shut. That silence stung worse than my father's fury. At least his rage was loud enough to fight. I learned quickly that family isn't always blood. Ruth, just Ruth, a woman from church who baked casseroles for every funeral and every flu, found me sitting at the bus stop one night. She pressed a foil-covered dish into my lap without a word. Later, she brought more. Warm food, a kind glance, an unspoken message. "You're not invisible." But the house I'd grown up in was sealed shut. My father never called. My mother never wrote. My brother, full of pride, crossed the street when he saw me, and every Sunday the church bells rang to remind me that somewhere inside that building they sat in a row pretending I had never existed. I worked nights at a diner off the highway, balancing plates heavier than my strength, my body aching as the baby grew. Some customers left tips, others left smirks. "Deacon's daughter?" one asked, eyes darting to my stomach. I nodded once, then walked away before my tears spilled into the coffee. I kept every paycheck folded into a worn envelope. Rent, groceries, bus fare. My world shrank to survival, $1 and one day at a time. And still, in the quiet of night, the echo of that slammed door returned. It told me I was unwanted. It told me I was alone. But it also told me something else, though I couldn't hear it clearly yet. It told me I would have to build a life where no one could ever shut me out again. The hospital smelled like bleach and lemon. I went into labor during the breakfast rush, balancing a tray of waffles when the pain took my breath away. The manager wanted me to finish the shift. I laughed once, short and humorless, and walked out the back door with my apron still tied. A nurse glanced at my bare ring finger before she checked my pulse. "Father involved?" she asked, pen hovering. "Involved enough to slam a door," I said. She didn't write that down. I delivered in a room where the blinds didn't quite meet, a thin strip of light cutting across the wall like a measuring stick, of what I was, of how far I'd fallen. The pain ripped through me, then a cry ripped through the room, and suddenly the world rearranged itself to make space for one small person. I named her Emily, because the name felt like a soft hand on a hard day. I held her to my chest and felt the shifting tide inside me. The shame that had soaked into my bones didn't disappear, but it met a new current, stubborn, protective, fierce. I stared at her tiny lashes for an hour. Nobody from my family came. When the nurse asked who to list for emergency contact, I said, "Just me." Ruth arrived with a bouquet that had clearly been dismantled and rebuilt from leftover church flowers. She set it by the window like a claim. "You're not alone," she said, more statement than comfort. She didn't ask about the father. She didn't ask about my father. She only asked what size diapers Emily wore. Later, she slipped a grocery card into my hand and pretended it was a receipt I had forgotten to take. I returned to work a week later because life doesn't pause for tenderness. I tucked Emily into a second-hand stroller and pushed her to the sitter's house before dawn, my breath fogging in the air. The porch lights on that street all looked the same, yellowish circles thrown onto cracked steps. But to me, each one was a little tribunal. I kept my eyes on the pavement and moved. At the diner I learned there are at least 6 kinds of silence. There's the silence of people who don't know what to say and choose kindness. There is the silence of people who know exactly what to say and choose cruelty by withholding it. There is the silence that pretends not to see, the silence that expects you to apologize, the silence that calculates your tip before you open your mouth, and the silence that says, "You will never be forgiven." My father belonged to the last kind. I saw him once in the grocery store when Emily was 6 months old. He stood by the apples, testing them with the same careful pressure he used to apply to scripture. He saw me. I know he did because his hand paused on a red delicious and the skin dented under his thumb. Then he set it down and walked past me like I was a smudge on the glass. I waited until I reached the bread aisle to cry. Emily blinked up at me from the cart, serious and solemn, as if promising to remember none of this later. I tore the end of a loaf with my fingers and stuffed it back into the bag because hunger doesn't always have time for dignity. I found a room above a mechanic's garage. One window, one radiator that coughed more than it heated. At night, the air smelled like oil and iron. I taped a postcard of a lighthouse to the wall and pretended the stain spreading under the ceiling was the outline of a coastline. The bus stop bench at the corner became our morning pew. I learned the schedules by heart and the names of the drivers who would lower the step for the stroller without being asked. When the sitter canceled, Ruth appeared with a thermos of soup and a plan. She would sit at the diner during my shift, cradle Emily when no one was looking, and leave a church bulletin behind as camouflage. She never stayed for the sermon on Sundays, but she would sit with me at 2 a.m. when Emily had a fever, and the radiator clicked maniacally like it was trying to keep time with my panic. Word traveled in a town like ours the way smoke does, quickly, stubbornly, clinging to everything. My brother David got engaged. The wedding was at the church where my father had once lifted me onto the stage to recite verses I didn't fully understand. The invitation never arrived. I discovered the date when I waited tables for the rehearsal dinner at a steakhouse out on Route 7. David laughed too loudly. His fiancée smiled too tightly. My father shook hands as if he owned the building. I kept my head down and refilled water glasses until my hands went numb from the ice. When it was over, I counted the tips and bought Emily a winter coat that reached past her knees. I kept the silver chain my mother had pressed into my palm the night I was exiled. I wore it under my uniform, first the diner smock, later the polo at the hardware store I picked up as a second job. The chain lay against my skin like a thin line of memory. I never took it off, because some part of me believed that object might be a bridge, not back to them necessarily, but forward to a version of myself that wasn't built entirely from the words disgrace and alone. The first time Emily got sick enough to scare me, I ran the 3 blocks to the clinic and burst through the door breathless. The receptionist raised an eyebrow at my shoes, grease-stained sneakers, and the pediatrician asked if I had anyone to call. I do, I answered, and called Ruth. She arrived with 2 kinds of crackers and a look that could quiet a hurricane. Emily was fine. I pretended I was too. When Emily turned 3, she started to sing. Quietly at first, like she was testing whether joy was allowed to stretch its legs in our apartment. She sang to the radiator, to the window, to the stain on the ceiling, to the ladybugs that sometimes appeared like tiny beads on the sill. Her voice softened everything it touched. My days were hard, but my nights were gentler for the lullabies she didn't realize she was giving me. I lived in 2 worlds then. In one, I moved through grease and gossip, my hands chapped and my eyes gritty, scraping together rent and dignity. In the other, I watched Emily stack blocks like she was drafting a future, chattering to herself about castles and bridges. She called the bus the Blue Dragon, and the laundromat the Clothes Circus. I let her rename everything. Language can be a ladder out of a hole. The town did not change, but it rearranged its furniture. People who had once frowned at me began to run out of fresh expressions and settled for indifference. The church kept booming on Sundays. I stopped listening for it. I learned to shop at the hour when the aisles were emptiest, to walk the long way around the block to avoid the corner where the deacon's friends liked to stand. I developed a 6th sense for danger, the tilt of a man's smile, the slur in his request for more coffee, the way a manager's hand lingered on my shoulder when he said, "Good job." I dodged and sidestepped and discovered the art of being both present and unreachable. A new manager arrived at the diner, younger than the others, ambitious in that hollow way that made everything about him sound rehearsed. One night after close, he cornered me by the walk-in refrigerator and suggested a shift arrangement that would benefit us both. He smiled, as if generosity was his hobby. I stared at the thermometer on the wall and realized I could either freeze or burn. I chose neither. I walked away without a word, left my time card on his desk, and took the bus to the hardware store to beg for more hours. The night manager there, a woman named Pam with biceps like rebar, gave me a Tuesday to Saturday closing shift and a glance that said, "No one touches my people." I added her to the short list of women who had kept me upright. In that era, I slept the way a guard dog does, one ear lifted. I measured out my life in bus transfers and pay stubs, and the little circles I drew on a calendar every time I managed to salt $10 into a coffee can under the sink. I told myself stories in the mirror. Today you will not break. Today you will do the next right thing. Today you will be the mother you needed. Sometimes I believed myself. When Emily turned 5, the preschool held a family day. The children made paper crowns and glued plastic gems onto cardboard shields. Parents crowded into tiny chairs, their knees bumping against tables. A teacher asked the kids to introduce who had come with them. "My mom," Emily said, bright as a bell. She didn't look around to see what was missing. She didn't know that other children might have a father standing behind their chair, a grandfather in a tie, a grandmother with a camera. She held up her paper crown and announced, "We are princesses of the Blue Dragon." The teacher looked confused. I laughed, and then I didn't stop for longer than the moment deserved, because something inside me untied itself. After the party, a woman in a neat sweater approached me outside. "I'm starting night classes at the community college," she said, as if we were mid-conversation. "They have childcare sometimes. It's not perfect, but it's there." She handed me a folded flyer. I stared at the course list like it was a map someone had slid across the table in a spy movie. English composition, Intro to Psychology, U.S. history. These were not miracles, but they were doors that did not slam. I signed up for one class, then 2. I studied at the diner counter after closing. The smell of coffee soaked so deep into my hair that steam rose from me in the morning shower. I wrote essays in the margins of Emily's coloring books and learned to love the quiet, stubborn logic of a thesis statement. I discovered that discipline is a kinder God than shame. It asks you to show up, not to beg. On the first day of U.S. history, a captain in crisp fatigues came to speak about the Reserve Officers Training Corps. He didn't pitch glory. He pitched structure. He talked about tuition assistance, leadership labs, and a path. He talked about waking up early and keeping going when no one else did. His sentences were plain and clean, and they snapped together like joints in a bridge. I sat in the back and felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor had decided to become a ramp. I wasn't ready to step onto that ramp yet. I had a toddler and 2 jobs and a bus pass. But the idea lodged in me like a splinter you can't see yet, but will eventually have to extract. I folded the pamphlet and slid it behind the postcard of the lighthouse. That winter, the radiator finally died. The landlord ignored my calls. I dragged the crib into the kitchen and turned on the oven for heat, sitting awake beside it with a glass of water and a vigilance that tasted metallic. At dawn, I wrapped Emily in every blanket we owned and took her to the library when it opened, pretending we were on a grand expedition. We wandered the stacks like explorers in a warm jungle. I found a book about famous women and read it out loud until my voice broke. Emily fell asleep on my lap, her breath steady, the world briefly kind. The landlord finally appeared when the mechanic downstairs threatened to withhold his rent in solidarity. He fixed the radiator with a wrench and 3 curses. I thanked him like he had transplanted a heart. He shrugged and told me to keep the oven off, as if I hadn't been counting the minutes between drafts all night. Church people occasionally found me the way water finds a crack. A woman delivered a basket of toiletries and asked where I'd be worshiping that Sunday. In my kitchen, I answered, with a space heater and a grateful heart. She didn't laugh. She left a tract under the door, and I used it to level a wobbly table leg. My mother remained a rumor. I saw her once at the pharmacy, counting pills into a bottle with the precision of a jeweler. She glanced up as the bell on the door rang. Our eyes met for 1 second, then skipped apart like stones on water. She did not speak. I did not either. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted the words to cost what they should when they finally came. Years stacked themselves. Emily grew long-legged and quick-witted, the kind of child who asked the question under the question. "Why do people whisper?" she asked in the cereal aisle one day. "Because their words aren't strong enough to stand up," I said. She nodded like that made sense and selected the off-brand loops with marshmallows like a tiny defiance. We walked home under a sky that looked like brushed steel. I tucked the box under my arm and felt the old ache in my shoulder where I had carried too much for too long. The ache had become a friend. It told me when I was approaching a limit. It told me to set the box down before it crushed my fingers. Community college turned into routine. Class, work, Emily, sleep, repeat. My grades were good enough to matter to someone besides me. A counselor named Whitaker, starchy shirt, coffee breath, gentle eyes, called me into his office and slid a printout across the desk. "You're close to an associate degree," he said, "and closer to leadership than you think." He tapped the ROTC pamphlet I had hidden in my folder as if he could see through paper. "They will expect more from you than anyone ever has," he added. "That's not a warning. That's the promise." I left his office and sat on the campus steps, the concrete warm under my thighs. Emily was at kindergarten, tracing letters with her tongue stuck out in concentration. I imagined her future like a hallway with many doors. I imagined mine like the same hallway, and realized I had been treating it like a cul-de-sac. I looked at my hands, the knuckles rough, the nails cut short, the silver chain resting against my wrist where it sometimes slipped when I bent, and I felt a slow click inside me. Not a slam, a click. A lock turning the right way. Still, before any new beginning, there is always the audit of what has been. I went home and took stock. The coffee can under the sink had enough for 1 more semester if I stretched everything thin and prayed nothing broke. The bus pass was up for renewal. The sitters' rates were going up. My father's silence had matured into an institution. My mother's chain rested against my collarbone, cool and steady. Ruth arrived with a foil pan of lasagna and a stack of coupons. We ate together at the wobbly table and the tract under the leg held fast. After dinner, Emily dug through a box of photos I kept under the bed, thin snapshots from childhood that I had never had the courage to burn. She held up one of me in a white dress on a church stage, hair in a ribbon, a smile too wide to be real. "Is that you?" she asked. "It was," I said. "Where's Grandpa?" I pointed to the edge of the frame where a hand rested on my shoulder. Only the hand was visible. "There," I said. "What about now?" I looked at the porch light through the window. It flickered and steadied. "He's somewhere else," I answered. "We're here." Emily slid the photo back into the box and then carefully placed a crayon drawing on top. It was a lighthouse, of course, because that postcard had colonized her imagination. The beam stretched out over a scribbled sea, and on the shore, 2 stick figures held hands. One had crazy hair, one wore a triangle dress. She had drawn the light in yellow, and the sea in blue, and the sky in an aggressive purple that made me smile. She'd written one word under it, the letters lopsided and proud. Home. That night, as she slept, I stood at the window and watched the porch light burn. It was not the light of the house where I had grown up. It did not accuse. It did not test. It did not glare. It simply shone because the sun was gone, and someone had to keep watch. I touched the silver chain at my neck and felt its small, durable weight. I whispered a promise, not to the past, but to the future that had been patient with me while I learned to walk again. Before I crawled into bed, I took the ROTC pamphlet out from behind the postcard and laid it on the kitchen table. The paper made a small sound against the wood, a quiet, decisive thud. I put the coffee can beside it like a sentry and set my alarm for earlier than early. When I turned off the light, the room did not feel empty. It felt poised. The wound did not close. Wounds like mine rarely do. They become weather systems you learn to live inside. But I had mapped the storm enough to know where the pockets of clear air were, where the guiding stars hid, how to build a shelter that could travel with me. The slammed door still echoed, yes, but when it did, another sound began to answer it. The rustle of pages, the scratch of my pen, the clean snap of choices made on purpose. And underneath it all, the smallest sound, almost lost if you weren't listening. The hum of a porch light burning because I had flipped the switch. The catalyst began brewing in that quiet. One simple decision that would turn every slammed door into a threshold. The first time I stepped into the rock office, the air smelled like new carpet and determination. I was 22, carrying a backpack patched with duct tape, Emily's crayon drawings folded between my textbooks. The sergeant at the desk looked me up and down, saw the exhaustion under my eyes, and didn't flinch. "You here to quit or to begin?" he asked. "To begin," I said. My voice cracked. He didn't laugh. He nodded once, slid a stack of forms across the desk, and handed me a pen that felt heavier than it should have. That pen was the first tool of my new life. It wasn't glamorous. ROTC wasn't boot camp movies or stirring speeches. It was pre-dawn runs in icy rain, boots squelching in mud while my lungs begged for mercy. It was push-ups on concrete while the sun hadn't yet bothered to rise. It was history lessons and tactics drills while my body ached from night shifts at the diner. I learned to lace my boots faster than fear, to fold fatigue into the corners of my resolve. Some mornings I carried Emily in my mind like a flame. When the sergeant barked, "Why are you here, Cole?" I answered without hesitation. Because she needs me to be. At home, Emily colored medals on notebook paper and pinned them to my chest with tape. "General Mom," she called me, laughing. The word general was a joke then, but something in me tucked it away like a seed. The other cadets were mostly younger, fresh-faced kids without children, without bills stacking like bricks on the kitchen counter. They thought exhaustion was new. They thought sacrifice was dramatic. I envied them sometimes, but mostly I pitied them. They didn't know what it was to run not for glory but for groceries, not for applause, but for a child's next meal. The catalyst wasn't one day, one choice. It was the slow, relentless beat of a drum I couldn't ignore. The diner tips dwindled. The hardware store cut my hours. The world was telling me that survival had an expiration date unless I built something stronger. ROTC wasn't just an opportunity. It was the only path that didn't dead end at another slammed door. Emily was 6 when I put on my first uniform. She clapped like I had shown her a magic trick. "You look like the people on the posters," she said. "Do they listen to you now?" "Someday," I told her. That same week, my father gave a sermon on the wages of sin. I heard about it secondhand from Ruth, who had overheard the whispers after church. "He said the Lord disciplines those he loves," she reported, her lips pressed thin. She didn't tell me more because she didn't have to. I knew his message wasn't aimed at heaven. It was aimed at me, wherever I was. I decided then, my life would not be defined by the wages of his scorn. It would be defined by the dividends of discipline. The first scholarship check arrived like a reprieve. I opened the envelope with shaking hands, the numbers blurring as my eyes filled. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was patching holes in a sinking ship. I was building something seaworthy. At night, when Emily was asleep, I spread my coursework across the table. Maps, strategy charts, essays on leadership. I traced every line like scripture. Not the kind my father thundered, but the kind you carve into your marrow by repetition. Leadership was no longer abstract. It was bread, shelter, future. The catalyst hardened into certainty one afternoon in the library. Emily had fallen asleep against my arm, her hair tickling my sleeve. A stranger walked past, glanced at my uniform folded over the chair, and said quietly, "Thank you for your service." I wasn't even active duty yet. But those words struck me like a bell. For the first time in years, someone's recognition wasn't weighted with shame. It was respect. I carried that sound, the respect, the possibility, like armor. Years before, a slammed door had declared I was nothing. Now I had a door of my own to walk through, and each step echoed louder than the last. That was the day I decided I wouldn't just survive, I would ascend. I treated my life like a field manual, objectives, timelines, contingencies. I taped schedules to the fridge with blue painter's tape and lined the edges with Emily's stickers, so the plan looked less like a verdict and more like a promise. The first objective was simple on paper and brutal in practice. Finish the degree, commission, secure stability for Emily. I plotted my days in blocks: 0400 wake, miles before sunrise, class, lab, work, homework, bedtime stories, more work. I learned that momentum was mercy. If I kept moving, doubt couldn't catch me. I built rituals the way an engineer builds redundancies. Boots by the door, packed the night before. A spare bus pass tucked behind the lighthouse postcard. Protein bars in the glove box of a car I didn't own yet, so I kept them in my backpack and called it a glove box anyway. I wrote the week's tasks on index cards and paperclipped them to the silver chain at my neck when the weight of them felt abstract. Make it literal, I told myself. Lift it. Ruth stayed in my life like ballast. When I pulled 18-hour days, she ran interference, sat in school meetings, signed field trip forms, kept a casserole rotation with military precision that would have impressed any quartermaster. She never once asked when my family would come around. She treated our absence of them as a fixed point and aimed every kindness around that gravity. ROTC gave me more than scholarship money and sweat. It gave me language. Mission focus, command presence, after-action review. Those phrases clicked into place where old shame once lived. I began to think in debriefs. What went right? What failed? What's the next iteration? When I hit a wall, I didn't ask, why me? I asked, what now? I learned to read faces in briefings the way I had once read customers in the diner. Who was bluffing? Who was brittle? Who needed one straightforward order to steady up? The difference now was authority. I could act on what I saw. I could draw a shaky kid to the front of the formation and hold him there with eye contact until his spine remembered itself. I could look at a map, and see not just terrain, but tempo. Emily adapted to the rhythm as if she'd been born to it. She kept a small backpack ready by the door, book, crayons, a plastic pony who outranked us all. At night, she quizzed me on acronyms while I quizzed her on spelling words. We made medals out of construction paper and awarded them for ordinary heroics. On-time teeth brushing. No complaints bus ride. Mom didn't flinch today. Laughter became the grease that kept the gears from grinding. Commissioning came on a day so bright it looked staged. The sky was a hard blue. The wind tugged at the flag like a kid demanding attention. I wore a uniform that fit like a final answer. When they called my name, I felt the slam of an old door somewhere far behind me. And then a new sound layered over it, cleaner, higher. The cadence of a promise kept. After the oath, someone took a photo, catching the exact angle where the sun snagged on my bars. I framed that print and put it on my desk. The commissioning photo became my private emblem, the visual proof that a plan could do what love had failed to do: hold. My father heard about the ceremony from someone at church. He didn't come. He sent nothing. The silence, once a knife, had dulled to a fact. I let it be a fact and moved forward. Orders, schools, postings. I learned the strange ballet of logistics, packing a life into brown boxes, labeling with ruthless clarity, building a new routine by the end of the first weekend. Each move widened our world. Emily learned oceans and mountains and the names of distant friends. I learned staffs and units and how to keep my center while the map redrew under our feet. The plan evolved in phases. Phase 1 had been survival to commission. Phase 2 was credibility to command. I volunteered for the jobs no one wanted, the ones with naughty budgets, impossible timelines, personalities that sparked on-contact. I built rosters and rebuilt them. I sat in rooms where voices rose and said, "Here is the problem set," until the heat bled out and the work began. When credit floated in the air like pollen, I waved it away from me and toward the team. People notice who hoards. They also notice who shares. I failed sometimes. Early command, I misread a deadline, and a ripple became a wave that threatened to sweep a whole schedule off the calendar. I gathered the team at 2100, said, "This one's on me," and we worked until our eyes reddened. The fix was inelegant and effective. At 0600, I delivered the plan to my senior, owning the mess and the mop. He nodded once and said, "Good recovery." I wrote that down, not as praise, as doctrine. When the day came that I pinned on silver eagles, the room went quiet in that particular way it does when people know they're witnessing the moment a story turns. I felt two weights at once, the metal on my shoulders and the invisible ledger of every error I would now own before it happened. Rank was not applause. Rank was custody. Emily grew up in the slipstream and made her own weather. She ran track, wrote essays that cut to the quick, and called me on my blind spots with unnerving accuracy. "You can't out-discipline grief," she said once, when a soldier we loved didn't make it home. She was right. I let the silence sit beside us that night, unfixed. The plan could hold both action and ache. People outside the uniform like to talk about sacrifice, in tones that turn humans into statues. The truth was less noble and more durable. It was missing birthdays, and making it matter when I got there late. It was telling the truth to power without flinching, and telling the truth to myself when power was me. It was inspecting barracks with the same seriousness I used to inspect a diner countertop, because corners are where character hides. Awards came. I pinned on a silver star after a day that looked, from the outside, like courage. From the inside, it felt like arithmetic. Add up the risks, subtract the lies, carry the wounded, divide your fear into units you can spend without going broke. The metal was cold against my palm. I didn't wear it often, but on certain mornings, I opened the case and let the light catch it, a private reminder that honor was not my father's to give or take. Somewhere along the climb, the plan widened beyond us. I mentored cadets who reminded me of the girl I'd been, broke, stubborn, on fire with an unnamed need. I told them the thing no one had told me. Discipline isn't punishment. It's protection. Build systems kind enough to carry you when your courage takes a day off. Their faces softened. You could almost hear their shoulders drop, the way burden becomes architecture when you rename it. When I made Flag, the base newspaper ran a short piece with a photo I barely recognized, my posture more certain than I felt, my smile restrained. Strangers saluted with a glint in their eyes I had to learn how to meet. Respect, like silence, has kinds. There's the kind given because of the cloth, and the kind given because of the work. I kept my head down and earned the second, while I held the first in trust. We bought a brick house near the base with a porch light I insisted on replacing myself. I wired it steady, no flicker, no temper. The bus stop bench out front was a relic, our relic, because even when we had a car, I wanted the reminder. Never design a life so precious it can't survive a delay. On the mantel, I placed 3 objects: the commissioning photo, the lighthouse postcard, and the silver chain coiled in a small glass dish. Emblems of a route plotted and sailed. As rank grew, so did the orbit. A house steward came with the post, Albert, a man with courthouse diction and quartermaster habits. He ran the gate like a ritual and the calendar like a campaign. I told him, "My door is not a throne room." And he replied, "Understood, General." It is a checkpoint. We got along. December crept in with brass carols and polished floors. The command's Christmas reception rotated to our home. The caterers measured rooms, the band tuned in the foyer, midshipmen practiced their yes ma'ams until they clicked. The chaplain asked if he could give a brief word. "Brief," I said, and smiled so he knew I meant it. Emily, now a woman with her mother's stubbornness and her own mercy, prepared a gift she wouldn't let me see. She commandeered the dining table with scissors and photos and more tape than a logistics bay. "No peeking," she said, swatting my hand away. Her eyes were bright, with a purpose I recognized. I had worn it for years. The guest list held the usual suspects: officers, neighbors, a few officials whose titles wore them thin. At the bottom of the list, in Albert's careful hand, was a name that made the air stop for half a second: Thomas Cole. He had replied to an invitation Emily had sent without telling me. She placed the card on my desk like a question and a dare. I stared at the name until it meant only letters. "Protocol?" Albert asked, neutral as a scale. "Gate procedures for all guests," I said. "No more. No less." "Very good." He paired the answer with a nod that carried neither approval nor concern, only readiness. The plan had always been about building a life no one could erase. I realized, looking at that name, that it had a final phase I had not let myself name. Not revenge, exposure, not cruelty. Clarity. A public venue. Not to humiliate, but to remove the last mask. His and mine. I walked to the mantel and picked up the commissioning photo. The girl in the frame looked right through me, with a steadiness I hadn't earned yet when the shutter clicked. "We're almost done," I told her. The porch light hummed at my shoulder. The bus bench waited outside like a witness who had never lied. Albert tuned the house to calm. The staff synced watches. The ledger at the gate lay open, a neat column ready for names. The band warmed brass to a soft shine. The plan, years in the making, stood on its mark and breathed. All that remained was what honor demanded: the confrontation, in public, with the truth. And on the night the carols rose and the glasses chimed, the man who had slammed a door on me would step through mine. Not as judge, not as deacon, but as a guest, announced by rank and name. The house filled with the hum of brass and the low murmur of polished shoes against polished floors. Candles flickered on the mantel, and the scent of cinnamon and pine clung to the air like memory itself had chosen to attend. Officers in dress blues, chaplains in collars, midshipmen stiff with the weight of their first winter formal, all of them gathered in my home. The band struck "O Come All Ye Faithful." I stood in full uniform, silver star glinting like a shard of frozen lightning on my chest. The commissioning photo hung behind me, silent witness to the arc I had drawn from disgrace to dignity. Albert, at the gate, logged arrivals in his ledger, his voice measured and precise. Colonel and Mrs. Hensley. Chaplain Whitaker. The Harrington family. Each name dropped like a pebble into a pond, ripples spreading through the rooms. Then a pause. The hush before a stone falls heavier than the rest. Albert's voice did not tremble, but the syllables cut the air clean. Deacon Thomas Cole. The name hung like smoke. Heads turned. A few whispers threaded through the music, faint as moth wings. My father entered the hall. His hair had thinned, his shoulders sloped, but his jaw still carried the iron of old sermons, and his eyes swept the room with the reflex of a man accustomed to being honored. He did not yet see me. He saw the uniforms, the wreaths, the polished glasses. He saw strangers nodding politely, unaware of the role he had once played in my exile. He straightened, mistaking their civility for respect. Then his gaze landed on me. I did not move. I did not blink. I let him see me fully. General Cole in full dress, medals pinned, posture unbroken. For the first time in 20 years, I was not the one cast out. I was the one standing, center stage, with the weight of the room behind me. Albert announced as if reading scripture, "General Madison Cole, your guest has arrived." The silence cracked. Heads swiveled between us. The chaplain's eyes widened. A midshipman shifted uncomfortably. My father's lips parted, but no words came. I stepped forward, each heel strike deliberate, echoing in the tiled foyer. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady. "Allow me to introduce my father." No one applauded. Respect had already chosen its allegiance. He swallowed, color draining from his face. For a moment he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Smaller than when he slammed that door. Smaller than the shadow he had cast over my youth. The room itself judged him, not with cruelty, but with clarity. I raised my glass. "To truth," I said, eyes locked on his. "And to the family we build when silence no longer rules." Glasses lifted around the room. My father's hand shook as he raised his own. Too late, too shallow. He had wanted control. Instead, he faced exposure. The carolers in the next room struck a chord, their voices rising above the heavy quiet. And in that moment, my father, stripped of his borrowed authority, me in full command before witnesses, the slammed door of my past was finally drowned out by something stronger. recognition that could never again be taken back. The silence after the toast stretched like glass, thin, brittle, waiting for the first crack. My father lowered his glass. His hand trembled just enough that the stem rattled against the rim of the table. For a man who once thundered from pulpits, he suddenly looked as though the floor might not hold. He cleared his throat. His voice came smaller than I remembered, stripped of the echo chambers of church walls. Madison, he faltered, the name heavy, as if he had forgotten how to speak it without venom. I was wrong. The words slid into the room like contraband. Heads turned. No one moved. Even the chaplain's lips pressed together, as though sealing the moment in prayer. My father swallowed. His eyes flickered, not just to me, but to Emily standing near the Christmas tree, her hands clasped around the gift she had hidden all week. His gaze softened in a way I had never seen, but it was too late for paternal awe. It was recognition, yes, but recognition of what had grown despite him. I cared more for my reputation than my daughter, he admitted, voice hoarse. I cared more for the whispers than the truth. His shoulders sagged. The admission cost him dearly. I cannot give back those years. The room stayed hushed, witness to confession. I felt the cold fury I had carried for 2 decades flicker. Not extinguished, but steadied. It was not mine to punish him anymore. The uniform I wore was proof enough. Emily stepped forward then, breaking the stalemate. She carried a framed collage, the paper edges layered in careful tape, photographs spanning decades. Me at 19 in a diner uniform, me in fatigues, me with her at every birthday we had celebrated without extended family. At the center, the commissioning photo. Around it, her crayon drawings, lighthouses, dragons, crowns. She placed the collage in my father's hands. "This is the family you missed," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "But it's still here." He bowed his head, tears slipping down the ridges time had carved in his face. For the first time, his silence was not a weapon. It was surrender. I stepped closer, meeting his eyes. "Forgiveness is not forgetting," I said. "It's choosing not to let the wound rule the rest of the story." I set my glass down, reached out, and touched his shoulder. The same shoulder where once his hand had pressed mine on a church stage. Only now, it was me offering steadiness. Around us, the reception breathed again. Music swelled back into the air. Conversations resumed. Laughter rose cautiously at the edges. But the center of the room remained sacred. The reckoning, the apology, the fragile possibility of rebuilding. I looked to Emily, who smiled with the resilience of someone who had inherited none of the shame, only the strength. My father held the collage like it might burn him or save him, unsure which. The porch light outside glowed steady through the frost-dusted window. For years it had been a symbol of rejection. Tonight it became something else entirely. A signal, not of exile, but of return. Family, I realized, was never about protecting a name carved into a church pew. It was about telling the truth. It was about showing up. And at last, even broken, even late, we had begun.